This episode is brought to you by Communications Training for Coffee Teams, a new Map It Forward workshop tailored to get your team communicating more confidently to improve general mental health as well as business profitability. Click the link in the show notes for further details. Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Map It Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and unfortunately, this is episode 5 of our 5-part series, our last episode with the fabulous George Howell. George, we have talked about a lot of different things in this series, but today we're talking about the future of coffee. And I know that that's a very broad discussion, but when you look at the future, let's say 10 years from now, where do you see the future of coffee?
It's where I hope the future of coffee is.
Okay.
Because you see it, and I was more pessimistic about what climate change is doing to coffee than maybe I am now.
Really?
Yeah, only because I have had one coffee that is a hybrid,
Okay.
which has some roots in Robusta originally, right? The Marsellesa, which is a definite hybrid, from the combination of Arabica and Robusta. Many generations of Arabica brought back into it, and Rume Sudan.
A lot of people's favorites.
Yeah, and so this has been combined, and now there's the H1, which you can't grow it with seeds. You have to do it with leaf culture, right? So it's much more expensive to plant this. So that's one issue, right? That's if you're a small farmer, a farmer without the resources, it's hard to have those resources.
Even if you're a big farmer, the investment that's required to do that kind of grafting is kind of ridiculous with huge crops.
That's what's happening.
Yeah.
And so I had H1 from Soledad in Guatemala, as I mentioned earlier. And that was really an incredible coffee. Very sweet, very chocolatey, but really good. Right now, it didn't have the floral notes or whatever, but Guatemalans generally don't. They're more chocolate, nuts, and so on. But it had a sweetness to it. A kind of coffee that when I had somebody come over to repair my stereo, I offered him a cup of coffee and I said, I don't have milk or sugar, right? But you can have some. He said, sure. And then he started asking me if I'd put sugar in the coffee, which I did.
I love it.
Right?
I love it.
And I've had that happen to me numerous times. Right?
Wow.
People don't believe it, right? That takes the right coffee and then
you
as the interpreter, the right roast. So I know it's a little bit of a deviation, but I see out my role in the roasting process as being the classical pianist or conductor or whatever, right?
Playing a piece of music.
Playing Beethoven or Bach or whatever. And that's the farmer, right?
Yes. That's
the way I see it, right? And the barista is also part of that delivery.
Yep.
Right, to do that. So that H1, before that, there was just not a single hybrid I liked. And I do remember, my problems with Ruriru 11 in Kenya, right? Because even when we were doing the Coffee Connection competition with Dormans back in the
70s,
the early 90s.
The early 90s.
Right? Yeah. I was going around with Jeremy Block, really criticizing Ruriru 11 and begging farmers to keep going with the SL28, which is very much more prone to diseases and all the things that climate change is bringing to us. This has been the freak out for me, is these great varieties that cannot withstand the changes that are taking place in the pests. And how do you protect them?
And therefore the farmer and their economic stability.
Well, that was the issue. Go ahead with Rui 11. What you're going to see is the price is going to go down. You're not going to get the prices you're getting now with the auction system, and that was 100% auction back then, that you're getting. You're just not, because there's nothing driving that people to get the quality that they're willing to pay for. The H1 gives me hope.
Okay.
You know, there are new ones. There's nothing yet. All the hybrids in Kenya are not convincing to me, in that they do not have that amazing, smooth, velvety depth of the sweetest blackberry you ever had. Right? It's just not there. Very different from the geisha, and quite complementary. Geisha is like champagne. And the great Kenyans are Bordeaux, pure Bordeaux. Right.
Are you worried about losing them?
Super worried. Right.
Wow.
Mamuto is 100% SL28 and SL34. Right. And they've done that with my blessing. Right. I mean, I wanted them to do that, but it scares me. Right.
What's the timeline you think on that? 10 years, 15 years?
I don't know. Well, there's another move now that really just came out of nowhere. I mean, major producers of like Guatemalan coffee are now really going towards much more sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture.
Which is so wonderful to hear, right?
I am hearing that from people who were, up until a year or two ago, maybe later, but you know, from they're speaking about it now and doing it, right? They were from the old school of, you get rid of every weed with the herbicide and so on, blah blah blah. Now it's the reverse, right? Separating the trees a little bit more, growing, allowing
corn
plants
and stuff in between them
down there, bringing goats and sheep to eat the weeds right there, right? And on and on and on.
Shade planting, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, all of that stuff, right? So, and I'm hearing this from larger farmers, right, who are starting to really do this. That's exciting. Okay, so we have to see, you know, can they withstand it? There will be certain places that are gifted by nature or whatever that work. Prices could go up. Other farmers, because they're too low or in the wrong places, will have to change to cocoa or something else.
Right.
There is no two ways about it.
Alejandro Cartena has been talking a lot on LinkedIn recently, and I think this is where we connected about having this conversation, but he's been talking a lot recently about the migratory workforce in Colombia just abandoning pickers, right? Like that's a real threat to our complex agricultural product.
Huge. El Salvador, a huge estate, 400 people to pick coffee down to 100.
I mean, how do they sustain that?
Right. So this is a real problem, right? The technology may be there to some degree, right? But it will change the economics. But, you know, there are in Brazil, we're seeing already cherry sorters, right? That have been developed from cherry tomatoes and that kind of thing.
Right.
Separating the colors, right? And they're being able to go faster and more. You're on mountain slopes in the great areas, not on flat land.
Which so automated mechanized picking strip picking is not going to be possible.
But there may be more robotic ways to do it. Right.
Okay.
In the future, as we go. It's going to have to be some combination. You know, but there always has been ingenuity
at
work when the rubber hits the road, as we say.
I want to add into that. We recently had my identical twin sister on the podcast to talk about the energy transition crisis and how little attention we're paying to it in coffee. And my big concern is from the producer's perspective, as a lot of the countries that they've all signed the Paris Accord, most of the countries that produce coffee, and they're going to have emissions targets that they have to meet. And so when it comes to being able to adapt to those standards, my big concern is that the smaller producers that can't afford to move away from diesel engines, they can't afford to put solar panels, they can't afford to be a part of this energy transition, that when it comes to things like ECG and companies demanding that you are required to meet a certain standard before we can buy your coffee, you must show us that you are emissions net zero, right?
Yeah.
Is it certain death for...
Not necessarily. The countries, the governments, and the associations
will they step in?
Have to. Well, Colombia certainly was doing it for many years for their farmers. They really did a major advertising campaign. I mean, people bought Colombian like there was no tomorrow. I remember.
Except the FNC is very on top of a lot of this stuff compared to other countries, right?
Right, but it shows, Guatemala's done some work that way too.
Okay.
Right, on a cafe.
Right.
So it's possible. A lot of these poor farmers don't even have the diesel engines you're talking about. Right. So it may be one of those things where they went from no phone to the iPhone. Right. As it goes. All the people, the labor situation started to change years ago when the cell phones started to happen, and suddenly migrant pickers were able to say, no, you're not paying me enough. I'm going to go work for the sugarcane place over here and not you coffee people, right?
Well, and now they're choosing to just migrate to the United States.
Or work construction. There's huge in Guatemala and El Salvador. It's construction in those countries. So there is this advancement. And that's it's a plus and a worry.
Well, it could also be a force that drives the cost of production up and the cost of coffee.
Yeah, and a whole lot of more automobiles and need for all of that energy, right? So it's hard to say so far, right? But yeah.
So if to end on a positive George Howell note, what is the thing that you're most excited about with regards to the future of coffee?
I would have to say that it was actually tasting one of these hybrids.
Okay.
Seeing that it could be sweet, right?
Beautiful.
So
there's a plug for World Coffee Research.
Light glimmering out there, right? And so maybe it's possible that you can have an SL28, new birth, right? Who knows?
Okay.
Right? And got to be said that the SL28 is the only variety I know that was produced for commercial reasons, right? In the early 20th century, for being drought resistant. It wasn't about quality.
No.
And yet it produced perhaps, the only other variety that easily stands up to geisha in every sense of the word, in terms of uniqueness,
cup
flavor,
quality,
unique flavor, sweetness, higher to my mind than the geisha.
Wow.
I think so.
Wow. You heard it here first,
Get a
folks.
really good one. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Folks, you can check the show notes to be able to connect with all of George Howell Coffee's social media. George, I want to wrap this up by just thanking you for setting such a high standard for the rest of us. And I'm very grateful.
Well, Lee, thank you. These conversations really make me think about these issues again.
Beautiful.
Rethink them. And
Beautiful.
That's always of great value.
Thank you, sir. Open invitation if you ever want to have a conversation about anything that's going on in the coffee world. Come and beat your fist here. And
I'll call you next week.
Beautiful. Do you want to end this episode with your version of peace, love, and whatever?
Peace, love, and great coffee, especially Kenya.
Have an amazing rest of your day, folks. Thank you so much, George. Bye, everyone.
Bye, Lee. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in, friends. There are 2 ways you can support this podcast. Firstly, become a paid member of our YouTube channel. Secondly, you can join our Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video before you leave, and check the show notes for more information. Now, this is what you should check out next.